This isn't the story they teach in the medical academies, or the kind of case review you'll find tucked away in official logs. This is the kind of story whispered around the barracks, retold in break rooms and sleepless nights, passed from one field medic to the next, each time with a little more awe. The story of a sealed operating room, a dying soldier, and a man who, by every rule and regulation, was never supposed to be there at all. Dr. Urantessan, chief surgeon for the coalition's forward medical detachment, stood beneath the bright, sterile glow of operating room 3. Even with 4 arms, he looked strangely small surrounded by the sea of surgical hovers and whirring machines. Each device, programmed to respond to his every command, now hesitated in the sterile blue air, waiting for an order he couldn't give. On the platform lay the patient, Telkus Ven, a coalition scout with more courage than luck. Ven's body was fighting a losing battle, internal temperature dropping, dual hearts flickering in and out of sync, those essential double beats sliding further and further apart. The multi-species compatible stabilizer had failed. Hepatic function refused to start. Swarms of hemostatic nanites drifted aimlessly through his abdominal cavity, powerless to help as his blood thickened into something almost gelatinous. Euron watched the heart rate monitor, a once stable slope now nothing but broken spikes. Telkus had taken a plasma round just under the rib cage, an ambush on the myron front. The kind that started and ended with more blood than answers. Evacuation delays stole precious minutes. Now there wasn't enough time left to steal. I can't stabilize him, Euron said quietly, his 4 gloved hands going limp at his sides. He's crashing. Multiple organ failure. Every protocol, nothing's working. Around the table, the trauma team braced for the inevitable. Someone muttered, respiration's dropping. But it felt more like a eulogy than a diagnosis. The lungs, overpressurized, no longer obeyed commands. No one looked at each other. They just waited, watching the line between life and death flicker on a digital readout. And then, boots. Not the crisp, clean tread of a sanitized surgical tech, but heavy, stumbling footsteps that squelched with every step. A door hissed open. Wrong and unauthorized, slamming hard into the bulkhead. A man stepped in, no ID badge, no clearance, just a battered field uniform ripped at the sleeves, sweat and mud streaking his face, the left side of his jaw traced by an angry burn. Blood, fresh and old, had dried into dark patches across his arms. He carried a rusted old kit, hinges bent, field dressing wrapped haphazardly around the handle. Without a word, he dropped the kit on the instrument tray. It hit with a clang that echoed around the silent ore. Move. The man barked, already snapping on a pair of gloves he'd pulled from his own pocket. Euron blinked, still processing the intrusion. This is a sealed room, he protested. Good thing I kicked the door in. Then, the stranger shot back. What's the damage? You're not authorized to be here. Euron tried again. I don't care, the man said, scanning the monitor, eyes flicking rapidly over the data. Never mind. I see it. His hands moved fast, opening the battered kit and laying out its mismatched contents, steel forceps worn smooth, a leather tourniquet with stitching coming undone, 2 vials with hand-lettered labels, a scalpel dulled from being sharpened on rocks, a field dressing folded with deliberate care. This patient needs nanite intervention, Euron insisted. No, the man replied, his voice steady but urgent. He needs a liver decompression and rapid cooling, or he codes in 90 seconds. There's no vessel access, Euron snapped. The secondary blood ducts are gone. Everything's collapsed. The man didn't pause. Not if you go above the fault line and split at the dorsal bend. That's unsterile. But the stranger wasn't listening. In one movement, he made a clean incision, so fast and sure that the entire team froze. The scout bucked once, then slumped, shock overriding pain. With bare, steady hands the man found the artery junction, fingers probing expertly, tracing a pulse that barely existed. "Clamps," he ordered. The surgical assistant looked to Euron, then back to the intruder, hesitating. She passed a clamp. In less than 20 seconds, the bleeding slowed. On the monitor, the sharp drop in vitals stopped, a blip. Then a stabilization. The man didn't acknowledge the moment. Instead, he pulled a coiled length of metal from his kit, twisted it, and slid it up beneath the rib cage. "What's that?" another surgeon gasped. "Cooling sheath. Salvaged from a busted thermal suit. Should buy us 6 minutes if it holds." "That's not even medical grade." "It works," he said simply. Euron found himself unable to argue. Slowly, the scout's heartbeat steadied. 2 hearts, pumping together again. Lungs still heaved, but not as desperately. The body temperature dropped just enough. The blood flow eased. Ven was still in critical condition. But, for the first time, he wasn't getting worse. The stranger leaned back, sweat beading on his forehead, and wiped it away with the back of his wrist. Euron approached, adrenaline still hammering in his chest. "Who are you?" he demanded. The man slid his ID patch across the tray. "Daniel Reed, combat medic, 73rd Infantry, Earthborn." He nodded at the ancient field kit. "That's all I got." "Your equipment is obsolete," Euron said, glancing at the makeshift tools. Reed actually grinned. "Still gets the job done." "You used metal from a thermal rig." "I've used worse." Euron shook his head, glancing from the monitors to Reed and back again. "What you just did, by every protocol. It shouldn't have worked." Reed didn't smile, just shrugged. "But it did." Outside the operating room, word spread fast. Medics, techs, even off-duty soldiers huddled in corners, whispering about the ghost surgeon who crashed a code with a bag full of junk and somehow saved the day. Inside, Daniel Reed sat slumped against the wall, gloves off, hands shaking just a little from the come down after the adrenaline spike. Euron stayed close by, monitoring the scout's vitals. The readings were stable. Against all odds, "Tell Kuzven was going to make it." "You used intuition," Euron said after a while, unable to keep the note of wonder from his voice. "I used experience," Reed replied. "That's how we're taught. In the field. That's not how we're trained." Euron muttered, almost to himself. "Then you're not trained for this war," Reed said quietly, his eyes distant. Euron let the silence linger. "I gave up," he finally admitted. "I didn't see another option." "I never had the option to give up," Reed said. "You just keep going, even when you think you're beat." The realization hit Euron harder than he expected. Here was a man with no rank, no clearance, just a battered old kit and a will forged in too many firefights. What he'd witnessed wasn't primitive medicine at all. It was mastery, the kind that could only be earned the hard way. Dr. Urantessan, a surgeon who'd performed over 600 complex procedures, who could repair a vascular tear in a zero-G spin or fuse a neural tract in under 5 minutes, suddenly found himself humbled by a medic with cracked fingernails and a field kit held together by stubbornness and tape. Within the hour, Euron was summoned by the Coalition's surgical command. Supervisor Melron, a broad-shouldered Ghanari with steel blue skin, met him in the situation room. "You ceded authority in your own law," Melron said flatly. "Yes," Euron admitted. "To an unsanctioned human, with contaminated tools." "He was effective," Euron answered. "That isn't the standard." "Neither was the situation," Euron replied, voice calm but resolute. Silence settled between them, thick as the resin coating on a medbay floor. Then, from the shadowed side panel, another supervisor's voice, "Did you learn anything?" Euron paused, then nodded. "Yes. Medicine isn't always about method." Reed didn't wait for applause or even acknowledgement. He'd returned to the combat barracks in Sector G, where human soldiers bunked between ammo crates and broken air filtration units. The medical wing offered to clean his kit, but he waved them off. That night, He sat outside alone. Boots still caked in dust and blood. Sorting through the wreckage of supplies, half-burned gauze. A coil of thread in an old ration wrapper. A pair of bent scissors. Euron found him out there. The air humming with distant artillery. You never sterilize that bag. Do you? Euron asked. Nodding at the ancient satchel. Reed shrugged. I do what I can. Heat it when I can. Alcohol when I have it. You made a hepatic shunt out of a thermal coil. Reed didn't look up. Sometimes you throw out the manual when your patient's already dying. You broke 3 containment protocols, and kept him breathing. Euron sat down. For the first time in a month. Outside the security of the medical bay. Above. The stars glittered dully through the shield dome. I was taught instinct had no place in a sterile field. Euron admitted. Then you were taught by someone who's never dug around out of a chest in a swamp. Reed replied. Dryly. Euron turned to him. Suddenly serious. Show me. Reed blinked. What? I want to learn. Your methods. You want to use human field medicine? Reed said. Half incredulous. I want to understand it. For the first time. Reed smiled. Not triumphant or condescending, just tired. All right. But you're not gonna like it. They started at dawn. Not in the comfort of the training room. But on the back ramp of an evac truck. Surrounded by battered supply crates and the smell of chemical coolant. Reed set out his kit, 2 canisters. 4 plastic trays. And the battered satchel. Let me guess, Euron said. Rolling up his sleeves. No clean room. No hover tools. Just hands and a willingness to improvise. Reed answered. Wound packing came first. Reed showed him how to tear cloth into makeshift strips. Demonstrated the triangle wrap for a bleeding thigh. Timed Euron as he applied pressure bandages using nothing but an armor belt and 1 knee. You won't have 4 arms out here. You'll have 1. Maybe 2. And a guy screaming bloody murder. They moved on to airways, tilting the jaw with a nudge of the elbow. Improvising an nasopharyngeal airway with a clean pen. Tying a tongue off to the cheek so it wouldn't collapse backward. Primitive. Euron thought. But he couldn't deny it worked. By midday, Ian's coat was spattered with fake blood from training dummies. His hands shook. But he kept at it. By sunset, he could start and 4 blindfolded. Splinter femur with nothing but a crate plank and his own uniform sleeve. Why teach this? Euron finally asked. Because sometimes. Reed replied. The difference between living and dying is the guy who kept his head when all he had was junk. 3 days passed. The drills became habit, packing wounds. Splitting sleeves for tourniquets. Improvising everything from pressure wraps to airway blocks with whatever was on hand. It was grueling, dirty, and often frustrating. But it was starting to make sense. Ian's approach, all technique and sterile precision, gave way, slowly, stubbornly, to Reed's style. Get it done. And get them breathing. No matter what. The next real test came sooner than anyone wanted. A forward patrol limped back to base. Caught under unexpected artillery fire. 2 casualties. The first, a Bralari infantry officer. Shrapnel buried deep in his abdomen. Plasma sealant already failing. Blood pooled beneath the stretcher before anyone even got him through the door. This time, Euron was first on the scene. He barely registered the prepping techs or the drone hovering overhead. Instead, he pulled on gloves, dropped to 1 knee, and went for the cleanest piece of cloth he could find, his own undershirt. Tearing it in half to staunch the bleeding. The officer jerked. Eyes wild. His dual-core liver was spasming. Vitals flashing angry red on the monitor. Someone yelled for the clamp. But Euron didn't hesitate. He found the field kit, pulled out a battered suture loop, twisted it tight, and used the pressure to seal the arterial spray. His hands shook, but he kept going. Wrath, steady. He called. No one answered. But the bleeding slowed. The vitals held. Afterwards, with the Bralari officer stable and the adrenaline finally ebbing, Euron found Reed washing up at a battered field sink. using a cracked bottle of alcohol. "I tried your trick," Uran said. "Did it work?" Reed asked. Not looking up. Uran nodded. "It wasn't a trick. It was what we had." Reed allowed a faint smile. "That's most of medicine out here." That night, the two of them sat in the dirt outside the barracks, backs to the wind, the distant thud of artillery echoing through the dust. Reed stitched a tear in his sleeve with surgical thread, hands steady even in the low light. Uran sat beside him, sharing a meal pack. He finally asked, "How many have you lost?" Reed didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on the tiny needle, threading it through battered cloth. "Enough to know sometimes the best tools are useless," he said at last. "But the worst ones, in the right hands, can save a life." Uran nodded and said nothing more. When he stood, he reached into his own satchel and, quietly, tucked a new roll of sterile gauze into Reed's battered bag. It was a small act, a silent agreement. Skill without borders. Medicine without boundaries. The beginning of something better. But the battles at Delta Trench were just heating up. What started as scattered skirmishes along muddy lines turned into weeks of grinding, bloody stalemate. The casualty numbers exploded. Field hospitals were overwhelmed. Medics worked themselves raw. Triage centers became morgues by dawn. For many, hope thinned as fast as the supplies. And yet, through that chaos, Daniel Reed moved with a strange kind of energy, a man who looked like he had more hours in the day than anyone else. He barely slept. And when he did, it was curled up beside his rusted bag, boots still caked in blood and grit. He became the unofficial leader of the field medics. Not by rank, but by the unspoken law of who gets it done when no one else can. One brutal afternoon, the surgical calms crashed. 5 hours, no data, no relays. Just the endless drone of casualties arriving at a shuttle bay barely wide enough for 2 stretchers. A pair of platoons had been forced to retreat under fire, their medics cut off, the incoming wounded piling up fast. Reed and Uran went in together. No hover stretchers. No diagnostic drones. Just that battered satchel and a shared sense of urgency. Inside, chaos reigned. Reed handled a spinal compression with nothing more than a battered spine board, a torn-up top, and his own knee braced against cracked ribs. Uran sealed a ruptured lung using a punctured water pouch and surgical tape peeled off a ration pack. They moved like a unit, working by hand, saving 14 soldiers in under an hour. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't protocol. But it worked. By the end of the 5th week, others were starting to copy Reed's ways. Not just humans, coalition medics from across the species spectrum started requesting Reed-a-rig kits. Not exact duplicates, but the same logic: 2 kinds of tourniquet, metal clamps that could double as tensioners, packs of cloth that folded into pressure wraps, scalpels that could hold an edge even after scraping bone. Someone in HQ noticed. Within 10 days, there was a new medical directive, Field Order 148. Subsection D: Ret-up kits approved for emergency deployment in active war zones with high casualty rates and low logistical support. Cross-species compatible. Uran read the directive 3 times, feeling something tug deep in his chest. Not because it mentioned Reed by name, it didn't. The order didn't mention anyone. But he knew, as everyone in the trenches knew, that this new kid was born in the hands of one battered field medic with a stubborn streak and a bag full of broken tools. But it wasn't just in the trenches that things were changing. A coalition medical council was convened, 12 species around a big circular table, debating what modern field medicine should really mean. Should they stick with the old ways, pristine, perfect, high-tech, or adapt? Admit that war doesn't care about guidelines, and allow medics to improvise? Uran was called to speak. He showed up with the sleeve of his coat still stained from a vascular repair that morning. Exhausted but determined. He stood before the council and began. I was trained in precision, in tools that hum and hover. I thought skill meant sterility and technique above all else. He reached into his satchel, pulled out Reed's battered kit, latch bent, hinges squeaking, the faintest smell of alcohol and antiseptic. He opened it for the council, laying out the field dressing stained with old iodine, the wire twist splint, the bent 4-needle. He didn't give a speech. Not really. He told a story, about a man who saved lives. Not by following the manual, but by planning for worst-case failure and adapting on the fly. When their high-tech solutions failed, Reed's hands made the difference. When Uran finished, there was silence. Then a Zan medic with tail tufts stepped forward. "I want to train under him," she said simply. Uran smiled, remembering how he'd once felt the same way. That night, Reed was back at the barracks, sitting by a portable heater, patching his pants with surgical thread. His hands were stained with oil and dried blood. Uran dropped a meal pack beside him. "You've started a movement," Uran said. Reed raised an eyebrow. "Don't get me indicted. They're calling your gear standard adaptable. I'd call it not dying." "They want you to lecture," Reed snorted, shaking his head. "I'm not built for classrooms. I just want fewer funerals." "You got that today," Uran said quietly. Reed opened the meal pack and ate in silence. After a while, he looked up. "You remember the first one I saved? The coalition scout?" "Then. Yeah. He's walking again. Saw him at the forward gate. Full stride." Reed grinned, looking down at the battered kit at his feet. "This old thing's been with me since my first deployment. Every tool in it's failed at least once. But I know exactly how. That's why I trust it. It's saved more than a few lives." He folded the flap of the bag over the tools. His movements almost gentle. It was a ritual, the kind born out of necessity and too many near misses. But storms, both literal and figurative, were never far behind. That night, a late squall swept across the encampment, rattling even the steel-framed corridors. Wind howled against the tents at the edge of the compound. Dust found its way into every crack, even through the blast doors. In the surgical bay, Dr. Urantessan stood hunched over a table piled with med charts and blood-soaked sleeves. He wasn't operating. He was preparing. Because Daniel Reed, his anchor in the chaos, was missing. A skirmish had erupted unexpectedly on the southern ridge, complete with tunnel charges and makeshift explosives. Reed had gone with the forward medics, bag slung over his shoulder, sleeves already rolled up. 7 hours passed. The comms sputtered. Useless. Uran sat, bandage roll in his hands, folding it the way Reed had taught him, tight enough to hold, loose enough to be cut away in a hurry. The little things had started to stick. Just before dawn, the gates buzzed. 3 wounded came in, unconscious but alive, followed by a familiar figure, Daniel Reed, limping, arm in a sling, dried blood crusted in his hair. Uran rushed forward. "You should be unconscious." Reed just kept walking. "Not yet. You've got secondary burns on your shoulder. Might want to check the other guys first." Uran took him firmly by the good arm, steering him toward a cot. "You're done. No more for now." Reed didn't fight. He just slung his battered bag onto the table. But this time it hit with a different sound. The hinges finally snapped. The seam at the corner burst open, and every tool inside spilled out, clamps, wraps, the old field-threaded syringe. Reed stared at the pile, face unreadable. "Leave it," he muttered. "It's had enough." Uran crouched down, picking up the scattered instruments. "It can be fixed." Reed shook his head, exhaustion settling in. Maybe it's time someone else carried the next one. Later that day, Uran gathered the other medics, human and alien, together. No lecture, no slideshow, just a new kit. Not shiny, not branded, just simple combat fabric, faded green. He packed it in front of them, piece by piece, coiled pressure line, reused but clean tools, tourniquets cut from uniforms, splints that doubled as braces, a mirror to check wounds around corners. Every item had a story, Every story was a lesson. And for the first time, Euron realized they weren't just passing down protocols, they were passing down survival itself. Reed watched from the back, leaning quietly against the doorframe. As Euron closed the bag and set it down, "This is not just a kit," Euron told the group. "It's a solution for when nothing else is available. When you can't wait. When the right tool doesn't exist. When someone's dying and all you have is what you brought." He never said Reed's name. He didn't need to. A few days later, Reed was reassigned. Back to Earth. Not retirement. Not rest. Just another tour. He left his old kit behind, broken hinges and all, sealed in a crate marked only with a patient number, Ven 13. Euron had the kit placed in a quiet alcove beside the central medical wing. Under a simple plaque, "This kit saved lives when nothing else could." No medals. No ceremony. Just a battered bag and the story it carried. In the years that followed, the Coalition's entire approach to battlefield medicine started to shift. The lessons learned in mud, blood, and desperation at Delta Trench spread further than any regulation or memo ever could. Training modules were rewritten. Sometimes grudgingly. Sometimes with quiet excitement. The Reed Irrigay Field Medics kit modeled after Reed's battered satchel, became standard issue not only for human units, but for every Coalition race able to wield a clamp, tie a tourniquet, or improvise a splint. The philosophy behind it was simple: when the ideal fails, you fall back on what works. Reed's quiet rebellion, born out of necessity and a refusal to give up, echoed in every medic who now reached for a coil of field wire instead of waiting for the hover cart, or who tore a uniform sleeve to bandage a wound in the middle of chaos. New guidelines began to circulate, almost unofficially at first, then codified. Medics were encouraged to document when they'd broken protocol, and what they'd learned from it. Innovation under fire wasn't just a buzzword anymore, it was an expectation. Euron himself, once the paragon of perfect protocol, became one of the movement's strongest advocates. He published a joint paper, Triage Without Tools, Lessons from Human Emergency Medicine, that made its way through every command post. And finally back to Earth, where it became essential reading for new recruits. He sent Reed a copy, a small gesture of gratitude and camaraderie. There was no reply. Not at first. Reed had moved on. Just another medic in another war zone. Teaching by doing. Never looking for recognition or medals. But then, one night months later, a message arrived on the Coalition's internal relay. No sender code. No signature. Just a single photograph. Attached with no explanation. In the photo, a young medic, species hard to tell in the grainy low light, stood grinning in front of a battered shuttle. Across their chest hung a faded green satchel, patched and mended. On the flap, stitched in uneven black thread, 3 words, Dr. Daniel Reed Kit. Euron printed out the image and taped it to the wall above the prep sink in the central surgical bay, so every medic would see it before scrubbing in. Sometimes, in the quiet hours when the night was heavy and the wounded were few, he would pause before the picture and let his mind drift back to that first chaotic night in OR3. The clang of the kit hitting the table. The command to move. The realization that sometimes, when every rule and every tool failed, what you needed was a person who simply refused to let death win. The legend grew, not in official records, but in the way new medics talked in the mess halls and at the edges of the field hospitals. There were hundreds of versions: Reed with his rusted kit, Reed patching up a dozen men with nothing but tape and wire, Reed refusing to sterilize his bag because you can't sterilize a battlefield. But Euron always knew the truth was simpler, and deeper. It wasn't about the tools. It was about never giving up, no matter how hopeless, and being ready to improvise when the universe stopped playing by the rules. As the years rolled by, field medicine across the galaxy quietly transformed. Rookie medics arrived with bright eyes and fresh reader rigs. They learned to pack wounds with anything on hand, to check for a pulse with one gloved finger, to trust their instincts as much as their training. And, As if the kit itself carried a legacy. A certain stubbornness, you don't give up. Not while there's anything left to try. Somewhere on Earth, Daniel Reed walked out of the troop transport terminal one morning. Duffel bag slung over one shoulder. Uniform faded from years of wash and sun. He'd been rotated home at last. The war hadn't ended. Not really. But the orders had come through: reassignment. Stateside. Rest. Or maybe, just a change in the fight. He never made a speech. No parades. No medals. Not even a formal discharge ceremony. The only thing he carried was a replacement satchel, a gift from his last squad. Hand-patched with scraps of uniform from half a dozen planets. He wore it everywhere. The same way he'd carried that battered kit from the trenches of Myron to the shuttle decks of Delta at the old training grounds. Reed sometimes taught the newest medics, not in a lecture hall, but sitting on a curb, surrounded by trainees, passing around the old field kit so they could feel the weight of it in their hands. He'd let them take it apart. See the stains and the scars. Every tool in here failed at least once, he'd say. But every failure taught me something. If you know what's broken, you know what to do next time. He taught them to listen, to their patients, to their gut, and to the chaos around them. You'll have the fancy gear in the training rooms, he'd say. But out there, in the mud and blood, all that matters is what you can reach and what you can do. Back on the front, Uran kept the routine. Every shift, he would pause before the image of the young medic with the Reed kit. Take a breath. And remember the lesson at the core of it all. The Reader rig wasn't just a bag of tools. It was a living testament to the fact that sometimes, survival comes from letting go of perfection and grabbing hold of what you have, no matter how desperate or dirty. More than once, Uran found himself in situations where nothing went right: a plasma burst in the lung, a crushed spine on a medevac that ran out of power, a patient coding when the protocol said nothing could be done. Every time, he thought of Reed. The clang of that old kit hitting the table, the words move, and the deep certainty that sometimes, you just had to try. He noticed, too, the quiet camaraderie that spread through the field hospitals. No one ever called it by name, but it was there, a willingness to share, to improvise, to teach, to help the new medics find their footing, no matter how raw or nervous they seemed. One night, a fresh casualty arrived, young, terrified, bleeding out from a wound that should have been fatal. The team sprang into action. There were no hover tools, no perfect monitors, just the Reader rig and hands working fast. Uran heard himself barking orders: pressure here, cut the sleeve, tape, any tape. He watched as a pair of young medics moved together, improvising. One of them quoting Reed's old mantra under her breath: doesn't have to be pretty, just has to work. When they stabilized the patient, Uran looked at his team, bloodied, exhausted, but alive, and felt something settle in his chest. Pride, maybe. Or just relief that the legacy carried on. At the shift's end, he found himself alone in the prep room, the photograph above the sink catching the morning light. He reached up and tapped the faded image, 3-stitched words: Dr. Daniel Reed kit. In that quiet, he remembered what Reed had told him the night before his reassignment. As they sat on the steps outside the medical bay, boots side by side in the dust. You ever wonder, Reed said, why we keep patching these bags? Keep hauling them around, even when the new kits are better? Uran shook his head, smiling. Habit, maybe. Or superstition. Reed shook his head. No. It's because one day, you'll be the only thing standing between someone and the end. And when that happens, you want something that feels like it's been through hell and survived. They sat in silence for a long time, the war drifting on beyond the shield dome. And when Reed stood to go, he left the battered kit behind, not as a relic, but as a challenge: do better, improvise, survive. Years later, that kit remained, glass-cased now, beside the plaque, but never gathering dust. Every new medic learned its story. Every old hand remembered the first time they saw it in action. And in the stories they passed along, Reed was never the hero. Just the stubborn one. The one who wouldn't quit. Sometimes, in the late shift, Euron would catch a glimpse of a medic threading a new patch onto a reader rig. Or see a field tech teaching the triangle wrap to a rookie. And know, really know, that the legacy was alive and well. It wasn't about the tools, the medals, or the protocols. It was about refusing to accept that death was inevitable. About pushing back with everything you had. And knowing that sometimes, just sometimes, that was enough. And so, as the next war began, and the next generation of medics loaded their battered reader rigs, Dr. Urantessan would pause before that photograph, smile, and know that the legend would never die, not as long as there was someone willing to pick up the kit, say move, and try.